In this module, we will discuss our country's path to the United States Constitution. This will involve discussing the colonial history up before the Articles of Confederation through the lens of the concepts of collective action, the logic of collective action, and institutional design. That will give us an idea of why the Articles of Confederation were eventually, our first Constitution, were designed the way they were. After that, we will discuss the very problems that the Articles of Confederation had and the problems it created, and why it was an ineffective system of government. We'll discuss the framers' negotiations over forming a new government in Philadelphia. After that, we will discuss the components and the design of the U.S. Constitution and how that Constitution addressed the collective action problems created under the Articles. And after that, we'll discuss how this new Constitution, while solving problems under the Articles of Confederation, the previous system of government, that it created new ones that still our country deals with today. And we'll see how those different problems are laid out in subsequent modules of this course. You will quickly see that the concepts in the first chapter of the Logic of American Politics are central to understanding all of the material in this course, as I described in the previous module's lecture. And if you didn't believe me, you will see how they are playing a central role in explaining the details of our two constitutions and why they work the way they work and why one of them failed and while the other succeeded. So make sure that you have these concepts down. If you are trying to get through this course without reading the textbook, if you do not understand the material well enough just by going through these narrated lectures, you need to go back and read. The first chapter of the Logic of American Politics is central to understanding the rest of the chapters. So how did we get to the U.S. Constitution? Well, the path begins with our colonial history. The systems of government, while America was a set of 13 colonies, really set a foundation on which the Articles built upon, and then which furthermore the U.S. Constitution further built upon and corrected some of the previous issues. Back in the early days of colonial America, the colonies were a collection of colonies that belonged to Britain that were subject to the British monarchy. Britain's main interest in these colonies was really as a market for goods and an area that supplied raw materials to England, so it could then produce other things that it used to trade with other countries and other colonies. This system eventually created a legacy of self-government, an idea of self-government that drove our political history once we started the revolution, created the Articles of Confederation, and eventually formed a second system of government under the U.S. Constitution that's still in existence today. Early colonial America featured a system of home rule. The colonies enjoyed a high level of what we call home rule. By home rule, we mean basically that pretty much the colonies governed themselves with a couple of exceptions, which I'll discuss in a minute or two. In the system of home rule, each colony elected its own state legislatures. So even at the beginning, we have a history of building experienced politicians. This is going to matter when we get to the Articles. These legislatures taxed its citizens. They passed laws solving social issues and other issues in their respective colonies. They dealt with local issues mainly. These colonies did not enforce laws themselves, and they were relatively inexperienced in adjudicating legal issues. Those problems were solved by the Crown. Britain appointed each colony's governor and their judges. These folks were paid by the legislatures, but the legislatures, often responded to popular opinion. Now, legislators at the time did not measure public opinion like we do today through surveys, but they had other means, which we'll discuss in later chapters, especially the public opinion chapter. Eventually, these colonies wrote constitutions that reflected basically the system of government that was already established under home rule. And by the time we get to declaring independence and eventually forming our own system of government as a new nation, each of these 13 colonies has over a century of elections and local self-rule, which is going to prove really important in trying to understand why the Articles of Confederation looked the way they did, why it was designed the way it was, and which also explain, why we had the problems that we did. Now, while home rule worked in a lot of ways, it had serious limitations. Because we didn't elect our own governors or have our own judges, we were relatively inexperienced in managing our affairs and enforcing laws. We could solve problems through passing new laws, making new laws, but we didn't have any real experience enforcing those laws. And we also were relatively inexperienced in providing our own defense. The British Crown supplied an army that pretty much protected each of the 13 colonies. And since each of these 13 colonies were practicing home rule themselves, having their own legislatures and dealing with their own problems locally, we had virtually no experience regulating inter-colony relations and activities. So colonies were not used to working with each other. And we had no experience in foreign commerce by the time we actually declared our independence and formed a new system of government. Foreign commerce was handled by the government of Britain under the auspices of the monarchy. We have this system for decades, and it worked for the Crown up until the end of the 7 Years' War, or the war that is called in a lot of American history textbooks as the French and Indian War. After this war, Britain is broke. Now, up until this point, Britain had been trading with its other colonies across the world and taxing its other colonies as a major colonial power, but really not paying too much attention to the American colonies. Now, Britain was trading with the colonies and using the raw materials to facilitate its trade with the rest of its colonies and other nations. But Britain was not really taxing the colonies. They were not worried about the Atlantic colonies. They were worried about taxing other parts of its empire. Well, after the 7 Years' War, Britain was broke, needed to raise new revenue to keep going, and to pay off its debts. And the easiest way to do that, to raise revenue, is tax the one part of your empire that you haven't previously been taxing. Now, consider that we were already used to a system of home rule where each of these local legislatures were dealing with its own problems, taxing itself and dealing with local issues. Britain decides to start taxing the colonies after the 7 Years' War because it was broke. This begins to violate home rule and the system of governments that we had in the colonies and the culture that each of the colonies had cultivated under the Crown, and it adversely affected each colony's relationship with the Crown going forward. So it first violates the system of home rule, Britain does, by imposing the Stamp Act. This act was incredibly important, not necessarily because of what happened in the act, but how it was facilitated. The Stamp Act imposed a tax on all printed materials. And the problem is that this was the first imposed tax on colonies where they didn't have a say in it. This was the first tax that was imposed upon them without their direct input. And this really enraged most of the colonies, and you begin to see people fighting back, and eventually they organize a resistance, and this culminates in the Boston Tea Party. Excuse me. Unfortunately, as the resistance from the colonies began to get organized and systematized across the colonies, Britain starts fighting back, and then you start to see escalating tensions, and you see Britain retaliates to the Tea Party by arresting people and killing some people, and then the colonists escalated back and forth. So eventually tensions get to the point, and Britain starts imposing other taxes, to where the colonies decide that, well, we need to get together and start working together. And so they send delegates to off, and then they meet and form the first Continental Congress. And this Continental Congress was the first real incidence of the colonies working together instead of separately amongst themselves. This first Congress passed resolutions condemning these new British taxes and other administrative decrees. They declared a set of American rights, which was basically a reaction to having taxes imposed upon the colonies without their input or without any representation. And the First Continental Congress also formed committees of observation, which were tasked with boycotting British imports. And these committees basically sent delegates home to each respective colony, where these delegates were monitoring what was going on in the towns and the cities and the ports to make sure that people actually boycotted British goods. And if you didn't boycott British goods, you had these delegates to deal with. And this was important because this is another instance of kind of sustaining inter-colony relations, because now you have an established network of activists and delegates who are working across the colonies, forming the first stages of a national government. Now, this is not a national government yet, but you're now starting to see the colonies work together. People are getting to know each other in different parts of across the British colonies here in America. This is going to be really important change going forward. Well, after this, tensions continue to escalate between both sides. War eventually breaks out in 1775. Shots are fired in Lexington and Concord. The delegates get back together for a Second Continental Congress. Now, these folks had no legal authority to conduct war, but they know they actually have to escalate the resistance to the British Crown. And you're starting to see people want to actually separate themselves from the British monarchy. But they know they can't officially declare war or conduct war, but they know they need to continue to coordinate with each other. So they decide to go back, to send the delegates back home to their colonies, to establish conventions in each colony, to reconstitute themselves as state governments and actually write their own constitutions. And each of these state governments would be based on Republican principles, the kind of principles that our country is built upon today. And each of these states, these newly formed states, issued the nation's first bonds and established, and this Continental Congress established a national currency. As the fighting continued and tensions continued to escalate, in 1776, Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense, which is a pamphlet in which he said, we need to separate ourselves from Britain. We won't be happy until we declare independence. In June of that year, Richard Henry Lee called for a creation of a new nation separate from Britain, publicly declares this, which is again setting a benchmark, they're drawing a line in the sand. The folks from the Second Continental Congress form a committee to draft a resolution declaring their independence from Britain. Thomas Jefferson writes it, and it's eventually signed by the Second Continental Congress. If you're interested in this particular topic, the HBO miniseries John Adams, which aired probably about 10 years ago, the series itself is not very good, but the first number of episodes that lead up to the U.S. Constitution, the forming of the Constitution of Philadelphia, that chronicled Adams' life. It also chronicled how the Revolution formed, and it shows how Adams worked with others, and it's a pretty interesting process. And one of the best episodes shows how Jefferson actually wrote the Declaration of Independence. If that kind of thing interests you, I recommend that to you. I wouldn't recommend the rest of the miniseries after the Constitution. It gets kind of boring. But once the Declaration of Independence is signed by each member of the Second Continental Congress, now we have a new independent nation. And as a new nation, the Second Continental Congress proceeded to create a new government because it was necessary. So they draft the nation's first constitution, which is called the Articles of Confederation, with the goals of solving the coordination problems between the 13 colonies to form a new nation so they could pass laws, establish new policies, managing domestic affairs and international affairs, and most importantly, at least in the short term, is conducting the war against Britain, because Britain is going to fight back. Now, a couple of details about the articles are really important going forward, especially with respect to understanding the Constitution. The Confederation is a highly decentralized system of government. There's a national government that had limited authority that derived from the states. So it's basically the Confederation is a loose confederation of states where sovereignty lied with the states. And as a preview of how this is going to work, the Articles of Confederation were definitely a disaster. Probably the most ineffective system of government in American history, and one that almost had us continuing under the auspices of the Crown. So in the Articles, we have a new permanent Congress, so a legislature, which is not a surprise given that our politicians in these new 13 states based on 13 colonies were mostly experienced in legislating. So they create a new Congress where each state receives one vote. The delegation of each state gets one vote. There's no executive branch. Well, why not? We have an executive branch under the current Constitution. Well, before this point, before the Constitution, before the Articles eventually fail, and we realize what the problems were under the Articles, we had no experience executing our own laws, enforcing our own laws. That was handled by the monarchy. So there's no executive branch. Major laws like taxing, or major laws require the endorsement of 9 of 13 states, like major laws being states are required to contribute so much money to the war effort and to funding the national government in general. States sending so many troops and so many supplies to the war effort, so on and so forth. Those require the endorsement of 9 of 13 states. Now, things like amending the Articles as a constitution or taxing the states or people directly would have required unanimous consent. So that means these kinds of things are incredibly difficult to achieve because you just need one state to say, I don't think so, and the effort fails. So this design actually, if doing the most fundamental things a government does, like taxing and amending the system of government itself, goes almost as far as you can go in minimizing conformity costs, but it dramatically increases the transaction costs of doing business trying to do certain things. So each of these delegates that were sent to the Articles were trying to, and when the folks in the Second Continental Congress were together drafting the Articles of Confederation, what they were doing is they're trying to replicate the home rule they had before the Revolution started. They were used to legislating, they were used to electing bodies of legislatures and negotiating across political differences to reach compromises and pass laws. They were not used to enforcing those laws. They were not used to adjudicating problems created by laws. So these folks were suspicious of a strong national authority. Now, we have this new government, but we had just declared our independence from a monarchy that had imposed taxes upon us without us having any input. The last thing, and we're fighting a revolution trying to get rid of them, the last thing we're going to do is allow a strong national government. So we didn't want to have any actual executive branch. In this new system of government, Congress did have a few important authorities. They could requisition men and money from the states, so they can call for men, so many people from each state to fight the war. They could ask the states to send so much money. They could borrow money and issue bills of credit with the purposes of funding the government. They could fix uniform standards of weight and measurement to establish economy, to establish trade, to regulate trade. They could adjudicate disputes between states upon state petition. So if there are major disagreements between the states, Congress had the authority to solve those as long as the states petitioned Congress to deal with them. Now, when it came to taxing and other fundamental changes, again, you needed unanimous consent. This is a great idea on paper, but it would prove to be almost fatal in practice, because eventually we see that, like, if you look at the United States Senate today, which is constantly suffering from what's called the filibuster, which we'll study later this semester, filibusters would basically bring congressional action to a halt. One person would object and hold up debate in the Senate, and nothing gets done. Well, when you need unanimous consent for something, if one state, one person disagrees, it's all over. So you need, and as we're going to see, it's incredibly difficult to get everyone on the same page to agree exactly to the exact same version of a policy. So this would prove to be really, really detrimental in the future. Now, while Congress had a number of important powers, it lacked some really important tools of authority. Mainly, it couldn't compel states to actually do what Congress had required them to do by passing the laws. They couldn't compel states to meet the military quotas, which leads to free riding later. It couldn't collect taxes directly from people because, again, they didn't have the power to do so. So, again, this leads to free riding and underfunded government. It couldn't compel states to pay their fair share of government costs, which again leads to free riding and an underfunded government, which would be a real problem when the country has over $10 million of national debt after the Revolutionary War is over, and you have to pay that back before you proceed with other actions. It also couldn't regulate interstate and foreign commerce, which raised a number of really important coordination problems that would prove to be almost disastrous to the country, which led to a bad economy and a series of really horrible trade deals, which we'll get into shortly. So the states, they were chiefly responsible for recruiting troops and outfitting them for battle, but Congress was the one that actually had to get them under General Washington's command. George Washington was the commander for the American military fighting the British. Military command lied with Congress, and they delegated that task to General Washington and his close subordinates. Congress kind of acted under the Articles, and especially during the Revolutionary War, it acted as a coordinator. It could borrow money, but it could not tax. It was trying to facilitate a number of things, try to get this new country off the ground and running smoothly. But the problem is it could pass laws, but it couldn't enforce them. So they could borrow money, but it could not tax. There was no administrative branch, so Congress had to do all the work and try to enforce its laws, full of people who had never been chief executives. So that's a problem. So it really didn't know how to enforce its laws. Even if they could figure out how to enforce laws, given the limited authority it had under the Articles of Confederation, you had a series of people who were not used to doing this. So the no enforcement authority made it incredibly difficult to conduct business and fight the war. Now, bonds and lacking taxation authority basically forced Congress to borrow a lot of money. So it's running up the national debt, and this is a risky venture for a brand new country with a very fragile economy, fighting one of the biggest world power on the world stage at the time. So we eventually get gridlock. Basically, we designed a system of government that led to gridlock and was basically fraught with collective action problems. You had many difficulties during this war. The most difficult is that Congress was working with a constitution designed to slow down national action at a time when you need a strong national government to fight off the British monarchy, the greatest greatest world power, with the biggest military in the world. You had no executive branch to enforce laws. So every time they requisitioned men, they would pass laws saying states had to contribute funds to the national government. Or if they did manage to pass laws raising taxes or creating taxes, you had no enforcement authority. Congress did not have authority to compel states to do anything. So basically, during the war, states are free riding on each other. So and the problem, here comes the problem. Like we're fighting a revolutionary war against the British, which is a series of people who are well fed, well paid, well clothed. And our folks are, General Washington was doing his best, but when states are not sending enough men, like they agreed to do, and they're not sending money, when they're not sending food and supplies like they had agreed to do, the military is eventually going to be understaffed, overworked, tired, cold, underclothed, and underpaid, because Congress did not have enough money to fund everything it's doing, especially funding the military. At the same time, what made it worse is you have a struggling economy, because each of the 13 states was negotiating its own trade deals with foreign nations, which is basically leads to a race to the bottom. Under our current Constitution, the President of the United States conducts foreign policy, works out treaties, and then the Senate ratifies them. But basically, the Senate gets a take it or leave it offer from the President, but the President represents the country as a whole. So you negotiate with countries one-on-one. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress was not conducting foreign policy with other countries. Each of the states was doing so on its own, and especially when it came to foreign trade. So if you're a country dealing with with the states under the Articles of Confederation, you're not dealing with one country. You're dealing with 13 separate states, 13 mini countries. So if you're France or you're England or you're Spain or you're Portugal trying to negotiate trade deals with the states under the Articles, well, you have 13 states you can get to compete with each other trying to get your business. And basically what it's going to do is each of these states is going to keep offering you sweeter deals that are sweeter to the country you're trying to negotiate with. So these countries are stepping back, watching the states compete with themselves and keep giving these foreign nations the best deal. And when the 13 states keep doing that over and over, that leads to bad trade deals, which raise the national debt, trade deficits, and again, leads to a struggling economy. On top of this, Congress didn't have the ability. Now, it had the ability to establish weights and measurements and things like that, but it couldn't regulate interstate commerce. That was left to the states. So states were taxing each other, imposing tariffs on goods that were crossing state lines. Each state had their own currency, which is a problem. So you had exchange rates. Each state had to, every time you send a payment, you had to exchange it. So that just slows down trade. So you had a number of barriers to building a strong economy and sustaining it. And at the same time, you have severe examples of free riding that are hurting the war effort. And at the same time, so Congress couldn't raise taxes, couldn't raise revenues from the states. They would pass laws saying states had to supply whatever money. Each state had to contribute so much money. And not all the states would. And Congress would pass laws saying we need so many hundreds or thousands of new soldiers to go to General Washington's command in this part of the country. And not all the states would supply the troops. And when it came to food and clothes for the military, you'd see the same thing. In some states, the states that were furthest from the war efforts were the ones usually free riding. So states where the war was not within their boundaries and were not sending money all the time, not sending troops, not sending supplies, whereas the states where the war was happening in their backyard, like New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, were constantly sending money, constantly paying their share, while the other states that didn't have the war in their backyard were sitting back and free riding, because they knew, like, well, we're still fighting the war as a country, but I don't have to pay. And these states were actually spending those funds on conducting domestic affairs and dealing with their own problems within the states. So the sum of this was we had a very bad economy and we had a war in which we almost lost. It wasn't until France decided to loan us millions of dollars and supply a bunch of troops that we actually were able to fight off the British and eventually wear them down to where we win the war. So after the war, these problems continue. You have a war-torn economy where the Congress owed $25 million to American creditors at the time and another $10 million to foreign governments. And the problem is the most urgent concern is they owed the Army money in back pay because they weren't paying the troops, all of the troops, on a regular basis during the war. So these folks are out there for years at a time. They're not clothed very well, they're hungry, and they're not getting paid. Why is that a big issue? Like, well, on top of a poor economy where you have foreign governments millions that they want back, and you have a country with a militia that's poorly paid, understaffed, poorly clothed. Each of these countries is like, we can come collect the money soon. We can just declare war on this United States because their military is in tatters. And we know France just saved them. And France was like, well, if you don't start paying us back, we'll just take you over. And Britain was like, oh, well, we lost the current war, but we can come right back and take you back. Because everyone knew the country was in really dire straits. Mainly because we set up a system of government that really couldn't carry out its own duties and operate effectively. So Congress is having incredible trouble paying back the debt. So after the war, Congress would pass laws prescribing annual state contributions to reduce the debt over a couple of decades, which would have been fine if they could actually make those payments to foreign governments. But the problem is that the states, no one had any confidence the states would actually step forward to accept these policies and actually contribute money and help pay back the debt. Why? Because, well, during a crucial time in our country, the Revolutionary War, we just finished. States were rampantly free riding in the first place, so why would they stop doing that going forward? On top of all this, our troops go home. Now, the economy's in bad shape pretty much nationwide. And people are jobless, they're poor, and now our troops go home and they're losing their homes because they were not making mortgage payments on their farms and whatnot and on their other properties while they're off at war. So our thank you as a nation to them coming home from war is, well, the bank's going to take your farm. Well, this happens and we had so many troops who experienced this in combination with a really bad economy. People start marching on state houses and raising holy hell and protesting, saying, this government's not working, and how dare you take our farms away? We don't have any money, we don't have jobs, and you guys owe us money. So you see a series of revolts back home. You could just, without doing modern 20th, 21st century public opinion surveys, everyone in state governments across the country could see, and then in Congress could see that people were unhappy, and we had some severe problems that we had to address. So you have everything kind of hits ahead with Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. But there was a series of similar rebellions across the country. Now, they managed to quell the rebellion in Massachusetts, but this happened so often across the country that enough people in the state saw that we have to fix this current system of government. So a few states in 1786 actually call for a constitutional convention to improve the design of the articles. And most of the 13 states decide to send delegates to Philadelphia for a constitutional convention that would make minor changes to the existing Constitution. However, most of the delegates who showed up knew that they were probably going to overhaul the Articles of Confederation and probably create something new, which is exactly what they did. The 55 delegates who met in Philadelphia in 1787 basically drafted a new Constitution. But it took them a long time to get there, and there were many, many, many arguments along the way. Now, they show up to Philadelphia having the shared experience of going through a disastrous war and its aftermath, a severe recession. And they come to Philadelphia with a number of shared philosophical influences. They all had been schooled in popular sovereignty under what John Locke wrote about. They're aware of Sir Isaac Newton, who was laying the foundation for the modern study of physics and mechanics. His discovery of the law of physical relations, such as gravity, inspired the framers to search for comparable laws governing social relations. Montesquieu, a French baron, supplied the framers with the nuts and bolts of a design of government, particularly his classification of governmental functions and forms as legislative, executive, and judicial. So it was his idea to have separate branches of government. And he championed limited government, limited not only in the nature of its authority, but also in the size of the political community it encompassed. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher who treated politics as a competition among competing interests. You could see how that you'll see elements of that in the eventual document that they ratified in the 1787 and 88 and 89. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison acted as their own political philosophers. Madison had written The Vices of the Political System of the United States, which basically laid out most of the complaints that I had laid out over the last 15 minutes or so. When they get to Philadelphia, Patrick Henry had complained and resigned. He said, well, once we start doing things here, I know that we're actually not going to make minor changes. I'm getting out of here. So, but by unanimous agreement, they appointed General George Washington to preside over the proceedings because he was the most respected person in the country and someone that they trusted. James Madison is in the front row taking notes. The first proposal to overhaul the Articles was written by James Madison and his fellow strong nationalists. They proposed a bicameral legislature where there would be a lower chamber and upper chamber. The lower chamber would be apportioned among the states by population, and you'd have their elected representatives directly elected. The lower chamber would elect members from the upper chamber, appoint them to the and appoint people from lists supplied by the state legislatures. In this Virginia plan, you had this new national government would have veto power over the states, which basically would make the national government, the new national government, superior and would have sovereignty over states. So the national government could pass laws to veto state laws. And to address the issues that Congress had enforcing its own laws, they proposed using the military to compel states if they did not fulfill their obligation. Instead of proposing one chief executive, they proposed what was what they called a council of revision to act as what would eventually be the executive branch. This council of revision would consist of a president and the equivalent of a Supreme Court. And they would work together to address laws and decide whether they wanted to veto laws that came from Congress. And an opposition formed to this. Many of the states that were reluctant to go to Philadelphia under a new constitution to address the Articles and really appreciated the Articles of Confederation and wanted to keep it for the most part, they feared that this was going too far, and so they barred this from getting passed in Philadelphia. They blocked the vote, kept it from getting a majority, and with the promise that they would offer an alternative. Well, they eventually get around to proposing one. New Jersey delegate William Patterson was their leader. They proposed a response quickly. So the problem with the Virginia plan for the what are considered the anti-federalists in the room, the folks who really like the Articles for preserving states' rights, they were second movers. The Virginia plan was the first, kind of set the agenda and the direction of the negotiations in Philadelphia. So basically they're reactionary. So their draft failed to propose an alternative to the Virginia plan in terms of having an executive and a judiciary. Basically what they proposed was the same system of government that we had under the Articles, but it did give this Congress the power to tax, and they also allowed a simple majority to enact national policy rather than supermajorities. So any really relatively important laws could pass by simple majority, which is a real improvement. But others in the room argued that it wasn't enough. And what this leads to is debate rages for weeks. And eventually this thing ends up in a stalemate. James Madison was really furious with this, and delegates agreed to send the question of Congress to a committee. They left Madison off of it because they feared Madison was too vocal and too supportive of a much stronger national government than a lot of the states' rights delegates were comfortable with. But eventually, they reach a compromise. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that they were in Philadelphia for months and they wanted to go home. So they eventually get around to a great compromise, which ended up with taking elements of both plans and proposing it to the to the committee and to the convention in Philadelphia. Excuse me. Each side got something. They kept the two legislative chambers. There would be an upper chamber, which would operate very similarly to the Articles of Confederation. This thing would be called a Senate, and it would be composed of 2 delegates sent from each state legislature who would serve a 6-year term. So you'd have some stability in the upper chamber in terms of how long people are in office and how much time you'd have between elections. You'd also have a lower chamber, which represented Madison's directly elected chamber of people, and where the number of seats allocated to states was directly proportional to its share of the country's population. And the unanimous agreement rule was gone. To pass laws, you didn't need unanimous agreement. To pass, there was nothing in this new agreement, this compromise, nothing would require unanimous agreement. So this dramatically lowered transaction costs, and it made it much easier to coordinate national policy. Now, to pass laws through this bicameral Congress, you only needed a majority required in each chamber to pass legislation. And you see this, and they drafted Article 1, Section 8, which established the Commerce Clause, which allowed Congress to regulate commerce between the states, interstate commerce, and what's called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which is also called the Elastic Clause, which basically the language, this isn't quoting it directly, allows Congress to do everything necessary and proper to fulfill its duties as stated in the U.S. Constitution. This would end up being a clause used over and over to justify dramatic expansions of federal authority, as well as the Commerce Clause. Madison first hates anything that was different than the Virginia Plan, but he comes around completely and embraces this idea and improves upon it by offering, adding to the compromise, a system of checks and balances, which you'd have different branches of government, each with some sort of veto power over the others. And he genuinely supported a genuine separation of powers. So the new Congress would have the House of Representatives. You'd have citizens delegating responsibility for public policy to their elected officials. So that's a new feature of what would be the new government under the Articles. Under the Articles, you had state legislatures appointing members of Congress. This continues for the U.S. Senate, so you have some continuity from the Articles to this new government. But you have now a system of delegation, which is relatively new. Instead of having delegation from state legislatures to a national legislature, you have that in the Senate, but you have now also delegation from the masses, from the population in general, delegating to elected representatives from their districts. So the delegation now is a key way to control transaction costs involved in solving society's problems. I mean, we have huge problems at this point. We have a tattered economy. We owe foreign governments a lot of money that we didn't have the assets to pay back. Now we're giving us a system of government that allows us to find ways to solve these problems and dramatically reducing transaction costs that were present under the Articles by setting up a new system of delegation, basically a representative democracy. This problem is that we're now delegating, the masses are electing representatives, delegating the business of governing to people in their districts in the House, and state legislatures, delegating the business of government to people they appoint to the U.S. Senate. But this creates so this solves the transaction costs, the really high transaction costs of doing business under the Articles, but it creates a new problem. It creates a problem about accountability. How does the citizenry hold these elected representatives accountable? So what you have is now we have a new system of delegation that solves the transaction problems and potentially the coordination problems under the Articles with this new system of delegation, this new system of elected government, directly elected government. But the problem is that we now have a system of delegation. With delegation is a form of the principal agent problem. If you remember from the first chapter, the general public, as principals, is delegating a task of politics and policy making to elected representatives in government, who are going to go far away from home. Now, this is not a time of mass communications where you can monitor people relatively quickly. This is a time when it took weeks to get from, one state to another, sometimes months. So it's going to make it very difficult to monitor your elected representatives. So you're delegating the important tasks of conducting the business of politics and governing that you can't do yourself, but you can't monitor what these folks are doing very easily. So you have this huge potential for agency loss. You're delegating responsibility of governing to these elected representatives, but with this comes agency loss. Because there's going to be a difference between what each individual citizen would want the government to do. There's going to be a difference between that and what these elected representatives actually work out in both chambers of Congress. So, and you also have what's called hidden action and hidden information, right? These elected representatives are eventually going to know a lot more about what they're doing than the people who are electing them. And they're doing things not necessarily behind closed doors. I mean, the Congress's actions are public, but at this time it's very difficult for most citizens to go monitor this if they choose to. So you have huge potential for agency loss with this new system of government. And as the first chapter laid out, and as I laid out in the first module's lecture, there are 3 ways you can minimize this. You can screen your agents very selectively. You can make sure that they're going to be good agents. That's basically what we do in elections by, via campaigns. These folks campaign and compete with each other and expose each other's flaws for the benefit of winning a majority of their constituents' votes. Monitoring is difficult, right? As I just described. Well, because these folks have the expertise and you don't, and they're far away from home and you're not going to watch them. So this system of elections set up, at least in the House of Representatives, provides an actual way of monitoring. Why? Because a challenger to an incumbent. Now, in the first particular Congress, first set of elections, you have an issue. This can't happen in the first set of elections. These people are just campaigning, competing for your vote. So you can screen them, but you can't monitor them. Well, when these folks are running for re-election, that's when monitoring comes in. Again, the masses are not watching these folks from afar, but when these folks in the House run for re-election every 2 years, they're going to have challengers in the district, and these challengers are going to be pointing out all the flaws that the incumbent has committed and all of their weaknesses. So that's not perfect monitoring, but it's better than what you had before. And punishment, which is also via the system of elections. You take the task away from them and find someone else to do it. That's what elections do. Incumbents run for re-election in the hope that you're giving them the office and the responsibilities for another couple of years if it's the House. And, if the citizenry is duly dissatisfied with the jobs they're doing, they can just choose to vote for someone else. Now, this is not a perfect system. As we'll see going forward, the system of elections is not really all that. I mean, it's effective, but not perfectly effective. In this country, we have over 90% of the United States House of Representatives re-elected every 2 years. And in the Senate, now that it's directly elected, it wasn't directly elected back then, but with the 17th Amendment, we directly elect senators. 70 to 80% in any given year of the Senate is re-elected, of the folks who are up for re-election. So sometimes it doesn't appear that there's all that much accountability if most of these folks are allowed to stay in office and there's not a whole lot of turnover. One thing this great compromise, which eventually becomes the United States Constitution, supplied is a chief executive, which is not something you had under the Articles. Now you have a branch with the sole responsibility of enforcing the laws. The Great Compromise proposed a President of the United States and executive branch to actually enforce the laws that Congress passes. Now, when they were debating what to do with the executive, the choices ranged between, okay, we're going to have a president, so how long do we elect them? Some people said, well, elect them for life. And others said, no, we only need to elect them every couple of years, or they should be frequently up for re-election. And there were a number of different options on the table. And the folks who said elected for life were probably thinking, well, it's really not all that bad. Why? It's because everyone in the room knew who the first president was going to be. It was going to be George Washington. Why? Because he's the only person who had the respect of every single person in that room, and he's the only person who had the respect of pretty much most of the American public. Now, we didn't have 100% support, but he had more than any other person in the United States at this point. So they knew George Washington was going to be president, but there were still a number of people who were really concerned about how much time this new president should get in office. And even though everyone respected George Washington and trusted him implicitly with taking the office after this Constitution gets ratified, they were concerned about, okay, what happens after George Washington leaves office? The people who really feared a strong national government, the states' rights folks who are from the smaller states who really feared a strong national government, they said, well, we like George Washington. He's great. But what happens after he's gone? We're afraid of the people. We're afraid of the next president and the next president. We don't need another King George from Britain taking over in the United States. We just got out of this. We just are now amending our current system of government. We don't need to ruin it with a new system. We don't need to ruin the design of the new government. So what they ended up doing is they make a chief executive who's going to run for office every 4 years. They get 4-year terms. And at the time they designed this office, there were no term limits like there are now. But this person would have to run for office every 4 years. So you have some, again, through the system of elections, this person's going to have challengers. So you have some system of accountability. But furthermore, if that wasn't enough to keep the president in line, they gave this office a limited scope of authority. So they basically gave the president what's the take care clause, which is basically the article in the Constitution that deals with setting up the executive branch said the president shall take care to enforce the laws. So the take care clause basically says shall go ahead and take care to enforce the laws. That's ambiguous, but it's not giving the president, unlimited amounts of authority. They're just there to enforce the laws. So also the president would have the ability to confirm appointments to government seats, and the Senate would have to ratify them. So if the president tried to propose someone who was really out of the mainstream, according to the Congress at the time, the Senate would be able to veto that by not supporting the president's nominee and not confirming them. And also, the president could draft treaties, could draft agreements with other countries, treaty agreements, and again, the Senate would have to ratify those agreements. So if the president really makes a raw deal for the country, the Senate has the ability to vote that down. So the Congress now is setting up, Madison and others have set up a system where the Congress now serves as a major check on the President of the United States. Furthermore, as another check, they only give the President the ability to veto legislation. So in terms of lawmaking, the President only has the ability now to veto laws. The President doesn't have the ability to write laws, edit laws, revise laws, so on and so forth. Only the ability to veto laws, veto the whole bill that comes to him or her from the House and the Senate. Only the ability to veto it, not the ability to revise it. If the president wants a different bill, has to veto it and wait for another version to come back. And to keep Congress in check from completely derailing the efforts of any president, they wrote in that each house needs a supermajority to override a presidential veto. And we'll see later in the Congress module, once a president vetoes something, it's very rare for Congress to override it. So if you have a Congress itself that's out of control, it's very difficult for them to override everything a president tries to do. How would we elect this president? Well, they set up a system of the Electoral College, which is one of the most convoluted things you'll ever get to study in political science and government. And it's a truly baffling system. So the Electoral College, a lot of people were afraid of giving our population direct ability to elect a person. They didn't want the president to be directly popularly elected. So what they set up was a system, what they call the Electoral College would be a group of electors from each state who would get together and then officially vote on who the president would be. Now, and each state would contribute so many electors, which would be the number of electors has varied over time, but each state's proportion of the electoral college would be equal to their congressional delegation, the number of people they have in the House plus their 2 senators. And so currently we have 538 members of the electoral college, and because that's the number of people who are in the United States Congress between the House of Representatives and the Senate. But in the Electoral College, currently we have 538 members, and you need 270, which is a majority to win. So this Electoral College, if you get a majority, which is 50% plus 1 vote, a majority of the Electoral College, you become president. So states are actually voting for the president. Now, over time, it's become tradition for whoever wins the most votes in the state. So basically, states were holding presidential elections at the time, and then, basically what we've established over time is that we hold elections for the president. People vote on the president, and the tradition is whoever wins the state gets the state's votes. Now, some states actually have instructed their electors to you have to vote for the presidential candidates in proportion to their share of the popular votes in the states. That's only in a couple of states, not all of them do it. Usually, if you win the state, you win all the votes. So here comes the arguments against the Electoral College saying that, well, my vote doesn't matter because I'm one of how many million in Florida are going to vote, and if a person wins Florida by 1 vote, they win all of the Florida's electoral votes, and it's convoluted. And we've had a couple of instances in history, including the year 2000, where someone wins the popular vote nationwide, but then loses the Electoral College, which is possible under the system. So what happens is that you have a popular vote in this country, but it's the Electoral College that actually determines who wins the presidency. It's so if in a presidential election year, it's not the November vote that really determines who's the president. I mean, it effectively does, but the official vote happens usually in December, where the electors get together and they actually cast the vote for president of the United States. Now, if someone if someone does not win a majority of the Electoral College votes, our Constitution, this compromise that was set up, then the vote goes to the House of Representatives. So if the Electoral College doesn't work to elect a president, then what happens is if no one gets a majority of Electoral College votes, it goes to the House of Representatives, and they elect the president. So the system of elections for electing a president was convoluted, is still convoluted today. Why would they do this? Well, they were deathly afraid of who the next president would be. Everyone in the room knew George Washington would be the first president of the United States. That was fairly obvious. The problem is who comes next? And they had no idea. And as a new country who had just gone through a revolution and then a terrible first round of a government as a nation with the Articles of Confederation, they just didn't want one person becoming president and then getting too much power and usurping Congress and running roughshod and becoming a dictatorship. So they set up, and also the smaller states, the states' rights folks, who were deathly afraid of a much stronger national government. So the folks who were really behind the New Jersey plan and were against a new, stronger national government, this allowed them to weaken the strength of the presidency and actually give the smaller states a lot more say in who gets elected president. And as you see, this carries through today. If you look at the battleground states in any given election, Ohio's typically a battleground state. Florida certainly is as well, but you see New Hampshire, Wisconsin is often a battleground state. Missouri's been a battleground state. Iowa, relatively smaller states have been battleground states on a regular basis. So states with lower population are having disproportionate say in who gets elected president. And so this is a result of the Electoral College and too many electors being concerned about an unduly powerful president who wasn't going to cater to a majority of the population's interest. This is not my argument. This is just the argument given by many of the framers at the time. When it came to the judiciary, so we see a pattern here. The Congress is fairly well set up. The guidelines for setting up the United States Congress, what it can and cannot do, are fairly clear. And then it gets to the chief executive, the President of the United States. There's more ambiguity, though it's still, you know what the President can and can't do generally, but the guidance isn't as clear as it is for Congress. Then comes the judiciary. They spent less time negotiating what the judiciary would look like, and most of what pertains to the federal judiciary in the Constitution is much more ambiguous than the other two branches of government. They said that there would be a Supreme Court that would be given final jurisdiction between national and state differences. So when a state directly conflicts with the national law, when state law conflicts with national law, the national law would win. But if there's still a question, given the language of the laws, it would go directly to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, they gave the Supreme Court the supremacy clause in that article of the Constitution. They said the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, implying that national law trumps state law. But furthermore, they would debate a couple of additional questions. Who would appoint the Supreme Court justices? They decided on a president would confirm and a Senate would, or a president would appoint and the Senate would confirm. And what's this new judiciary going to look like? Is it just going to be the Supreme Court? Are there going to be lower courts? Is there going to be a multi-tiered system? They basically let the design of the federal judiciary beyond the Supreme Court. They let Congress, they gave Congress the authority to design the court, and they eventually did with the First Judiciary Act in the late 1780s that we'll read about in the Supreme Court chapter, the Judiciary chapter. Now, the Supreme Court today has what's called judicial review, where they interpret a law's adherence to the Constitution and declare some laws and actions unconstitutional. This power is not explicitly stated in the Constitution. So do not confuse this with giving the Constitution with giving the Supreme Court the ability to declare laws and actions from government actors as constitutional or not. They do not. That comes later in the Supreme Court decision in Marbury versus Madison. The Supreme Court actually declares that they have the authority to do that in a Supreme Court case, and we'll read about that in the federalism chapter going forward. A number of substantive issues were addressed in the Constitution that tried to fix what was wrong under the Articles. Our problems of foreign policy and trade, these coordination problems that I discussed earlier, were solved under the Constitution. We have foreign policy is directly under the purview of the President of the United States, which foreign policy will be conducted as one country, not as 13 or more states. Congress is given explicit legislative authority to regulate commerce, so that that reduces the transaction costs of conducting business across state lines. The national government will be responsible for the national defense and security. Interstate commerce, the ability to regulate commerce across states, straight lines, is given to Congress. It prohibits state discrimination against other states in various commercial endeavors. Slavery was the one really big stain on our Constitution. It declared slaves 3/5 of a person, which African Americans were 3/5 of a person. It is eventually solved much later, but slavery, they didn't handle slavery well in the Constitution. Everyone in the room agreed on the need to amend the Constitution in the future, given that the Articles were so bad that they actually were in Philadelphia to fix the old system of government. But they, of course, disagreed and fought over how to amend it. Delegates from small states insisted on endorsement of amendments by a large number of states. Nationalists who supported a strong national government argued that citizens alone should approve any change, so we should have national referenda. There was not a majority for either of those deals. So what they came up with was, of course, a compromise. The Constitution allows an amendment to be proposed by either 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress or by an application from 2/3 of the states. Any proposed constitutional amendments are only enacted when 3/4 of the states accept the amendment, either via their state legislatures or in special conventions. Most constitutional amendments after the Bill of Rights were ratified are done via acting through state legislatures, but occasionally states have had special conventions. Now, after they came up with a basic draft of this Constitution, there was a huge fight over getting it ratified. One of the big disagreements, even in trying to get everyone in the room to agree to what was the Great Compromise, i.e. the draft of the Constitution itself, is a lot of the small states kept hammering the larger states, the delegates from the larger states, by saying, by giving the national government so much authority, especially compared to the Articles of Confederation, they were worried that about protecting the rights of the small states. Because like, well, if everything's run by majority rule, you're going to run roughshod over minority groups in the population. So what they did was, now they argued that, and this fight led to to ratify the Constitution. So in 9 states, each state had to hold a constitutional convention, whether to ratify this new constitution or not. 9 of the 13 states were enough to actually ratify the Constitution and enact it. So this statement did 2 important things. It further removes the unanimous consent rule of the Articles of Confederation, and it withdrew authority from state legislatures, which might have had misgivings about surrendering their autonomy. Now, all along the line, right, the folks who are from the smaller states, who were states' rights folks, are concerned about having their interests protected. They're worried about the majority running roughshod over the minority over and over and over in this country. Now, majority and minority in those times, basically, it wasn't over racial terms. It was actually majority, minority, big states, populated states versus less populated states. So the really small states versus the most populous ones. And the small states were the ones constantly holding the negotiations up in Philadelphia by saying, what about us? What about us? What about us? So even after this thing is ratified, now the states' rights folks go back and start causing trouble back in the states. So the anti-federalists, the folks, states' rights people, who were really afraid of this new constitution that was drafted, and if it were enacted, what the government would look like, go to work. They argued that only local democracy could approach true democracy, and again, they start invoking fears of tyranny and the invasion of the citizens' rights. And so, to counteract this, the Federalists, who were the nationalists, folks who were advocating a much stronger national government, a number of them got together and wrote 85 essays, which are eventually called the Federalist Papers. Now, these 85 essays were mostly written by Alexander Hamilton, and then also with John Jay and James Madison, who arguably wrote the most well-known of the Federalist essays. These 3 men wrote 85 of these essays. They first appeared in New York City newspapers. They would eventually end up getting printed in other states. And this was basically a series of essays that showed the framers' logic in drafting what ends up as the Constitution. So these are the most, the Supreme Court, as we'll talk about, there's a lot of arguments over, like, when there's a legal question over its constitutionality, over a law's constitutionality, of, what were the framers thinking? Well, the Federalist Papers are our best guess over what the logic of the framers were. Now, any notes from the conventions itself also count, but the Federalist Papers are our best evidence of what the framers were thinking when they drafted the actual Constitution, as they formed that great compromise between the Virginia and the New Jersey plans to get to what we have today. And Madison wrote 2 of the Federalist Papers, the 10th essay and the 51st essay, that really lay out the basic logic underlying the Constitution that drives most of what the Constitution looks like and what it's trying to achieve. In Federalist 10, Madison wrote, "We're not angels, and men are not angels. So how do we get a government of non-angels not only to govern the governed, but to govern itself?" Well, in Federalist 10, he responds to the anti-federalist strongest argument about the minority trampling over or the majority trampling minority rights over and over. He wrote that a large republic can survive, and the reason is that, and you should go read Federalist 10, which is in the back of the textbook. He says, you know, there are going to be factions, and there are going to be organized interests in this country that try to unduly influence laws. And so the anti-federalist concern should be addressed. They have a point. But he says, you know what? What they're fearing is not going to happen for one reason. Our country is going to be so big, full of so many interests, that in our government, since our country is so big and diverse, there are going to be so many different organized interests, so many factions represented in the Congress and in the White House, so on and so forth, that no one interest is going to become unduly influential. So all these interests will kind of balance each other out. He writes, a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent aggregate interests of the community. Right? He identifies two ways to eliminate factions. Right? Authoritarianism or conformism, which neither is going to work. So he says, you know what? So if the causes of factions can't be removed, then you have to control their effects rather than snuffing out liberty. So you control minority and majority factions in different ways. Democracy doesn't allow minorities to dominate. The problem, as in a democracy, in the way it's set up, it lies with majorities. And if you have a direct democracy, you'll really allow the majority to usurp minority rights all the time. However, we have a representative government. So it dilutes any particular faction, and it introduces the size principle, right? So basically what he's saying is that the more factions we have in government, and the bigger the government is, we'll have more and more factions at play trying to pursue policies that benefit them, perhaps at the expense of everybody. But when you have so many factions represented in government, it's impossible to get a permanent majority where you're going to be constantly tramping over minority rights. That's basically what he's saying in Federalist 10. And in Federalist 51, he addresses tyranny again through separation of powers and checks and balances. One way to cure the possibility of undue influence taking hold in our new government is you have ambition counteracting ambition. So basically you have the checks and balances system. You have ambition counteracting ambition. Each branch of government in our system has a check over the others. Now, the United States Congress can pass laws, and within the Congress you have the House of Representatives, which has people directly elected by the population. One of the fears of having a House of Representatives designed this way, where you have elected representatives directly elected by the people, is that, and if you go back and read some other history books in more detail, or take a history class on the Revolution that also covers the drafting of the Constitution, whenever you read some of the framers' letters to each other, like if you read John Adams' letters to Thomas Jefferson or to Sam Adams or whoever, a lot of the time in their own letters to each other, they actually express the same grievances a lot of us have, that you can't trust the masses because they're idiots. They don't know enough about government. The masses are going to vote by passion. They're going to vote by impulse. And if you have a body of government full of people directly elected by the masses, you're going to have people who have to adhere to those masses because they have to run for re-election. You can't trust the House of Representatives to do a job like that, because anyone who's directly elected is going to, the elected representatives are going to be representing these passions, and you're going to get crazy legislation. Well, when they were negotiating the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan, when they come up with the Great Compromise, they set up the dual chamber of Congress to counteract this kind of, to mitigate this possibility. So even if you have crazy legislation coming out of the House of Representatives, you have a separate chamber that has to pass the exact identical bill. So in the Constitution it says, In order for a bill to go to the president, each chamber has to pass the identical bill word for word. If they don't, it doesn't go to the president. They have to have additional conferences with each other to work out the differences, because the president can only get one bill from Congress, and it has to be, each house has to pass the exact same bill. Well, that very process waters down a lot of potential issues. But another aspect of this is that at the time you had a Senate, an upper chamber, that was directly elected by state legislators, and they were directly appointed by state legislatures, serving 6-year terms. And their elections were going to be staggered. So every 2 years when you have a federal level election, you have a third of the Senate up for re-election, not all 100 of them. So you have a third of the election, or of the Senate up for re-election. Now you have the whole House of Representatives up for re-election, so that caused another issue. But the Senate, there's more stability in the Senate, and at the time they were appointed directly by state legislatures, so they would have the country more. They're operating more on in a national scope, and they're likely to tamp down any crazy legislation from the House, because due to how they got to the Senate by being appointed by their state's legislature, they're going to be more politically moderate. At least that was the logic given by the framers. And so the fact that you have checks and balances within Congress, so legislation is bound to be moderated just by this process. Now we have a Senate that's full of people who are elected directly by people in their states, but you still have, if you look over time, we'll discuss this later in the Congress chapter, the Senate tends to be more politically moderate than the House. So the House tends to send much more hyper-partisan legislation to the Senate, but the Senate usually moderates it, and if they work out the differences, then it goes to the president. Well, and then the president can veto the legislation. And as we'll see later in later modules of the course, Congress rarely overrides presidential veto. Now, if we're worried about the president getting undue influence, getting too popular, and to the point where the president can actually usurp congressional authority and start a war when they shouldn't, so on and so forth, at least something like that. If you're fearing a president might become a dictator, a president can only veto laws. A president cannot officially propose any legislation. Now, they can ask that they can send a draft of their own bill over and have someone in the Congress introduce it for them. But even then, the Congress, then every bill gets moderated and amended in the process of both chambers working out the legislation, and then that bill gets sent to the president. The president can only veto legislation, so the president gets a take it or leave it offer from Congress, and just the very nature of the legislative process, the president's not going to get everything they want. And if you have a president trying to usurp or trying to do something that goes against the Constitution, as the Supreme Court eventually, now this wasn't the Constitution, eventually after the Supreme Court establishes judicial review, the Supreme Court then eventually becomes a check on the other two branches of government. Though, remember, judicial review was not explicitly given in the Constitution, so in terms of getting this document ratified by 9 of the 13 states, part of the sales pitch was not judicial review. But most of the sales pitch was, well, we have a number of checks and balances between the two elected branches, the two chambers, the Congress and the White House, and the nature of separation of powers and checks and balances tamps down any undue influence and keeps everyone at check. And it waters down the authority and the influence of any, not the authority, but the political influence of any one actor in government. And that's what Madison's talking about in Federalist 51. Our checks and balances, the fact that each branch has a check on the other, helps keep any one interest from having too much influence over the direction of where the United States government's going. So if you're worried about a tyrant becoming, supreme leader of the United States, this Constitution makes it really, really difficult for that to happen. And the legislative process, even in the document written in the 1780s, makes it really hard for anything to get through and get signed by the president. For anything to happen, it's very difficult to pass policy under the Constitution. Now, transaction costs are dramatically reduced in the new Constitution compared to the Articles to pass anything important, but it's still very difficult to pass laws when you look at the legislative process combined with the system of checks and balances. So is this a perfect system? No. How was this Constitution derived? Is it some really eloquent, elegant reason that came down from some brilliant philosopher or from God even? No. The Constitution is a product of political compromise. You had 55 or so people from the 13 colonies, or 13 states, excuse me, in Philadelphia to work out either changing the Articles of Confederation or scrapping it and starting afresh, in which they eventually did. But they had to, if you just see how the different branches of government are laid out in the Constitution, obviously it becomes very clear that this is a product of political compromise, and it's not close to being a sacred document. It has a lot of flaws. So it's a question: does Madison and his logic and Federalist 10 of 51 is the size of the government's going to have so many factions being represented, no one faction becomes too influential? Is that really true? No. We'll see in the interest group chapter that you don't have any particular interest group in this country determining everything and running roughshod over everybody else, but you certainly see in examples time and again of certain interest groups having more influence over public policy than others, and this happens on a regular basis. And we'll see why that happens later in the term. But also, you see this Constitution, while solving a lot of the problems under the Articles of Confederation, raises a number of new issues that are still being debated in politics 200 plus years after this Constitution was ratified. The new Constitution created a system of delegation from the people to elected representatives, which causes a lot of potential for agency loss. And our system of elections doesn't go all the way to mitigate those problems. You have a system of checks and balances, which makes it difficult for any one particular influence or person to have too much influence over the political process. But it makes it really hard to pass laws quickly. So if we're in a time of crisis, it becomes very difficult to change a lot of things very quickly. We have we have three branches that where the clauses in the Constitution describing what they should and shouldn't do are often ambiguous, and there are a lot of questions as to how much authority each branch could have. So going to wrap up this chapter, in this lecture on this chapter, the Constitution itself raises a number of new issues. So in your notes, go back and keep track of how the Constitution actually has to, it solved a lot of the collective action problems, the coordination and free rider problems under the Articles of Confederation, but it raised a number of new ones that we'll be dealing with in the modules that follow.